So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are a nonprofit organization that promotes informed discussions around foreign affairs topics. And I am delighted today that we have Mira Rapp-Hooper with us. I was familiar with Mira's work before and then came across an excellent article that she wrote in War on the Rocks on geopolitics after coronavirus and the role of China. And then after I reached out to her, I learned that she also has a new book coming out that's looking at the future of America's alliances. And so those two topics together seemed like the perfect, a perfect combination for us for a talk today. So I'm just going to read through her bio quickly so you all know how accomplished she is, even though she looks quite young. And then I'll turn it over to Mira for the talk. So she is the Stephen A. Schwarzman Senior Fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and is also a Senior Fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. At CFR, Dr. Rapp-Hooper's work explores national security and strategy issues in Asia, including great power competition, alliances, nuclear issues, and territorial disputes, the implications of China's rise for the international order, and the future of American strategy toward China and Asia. Dr. Rapp-Hooper was formerly a senior fellow with the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, a fellow with the CSIS Asia Program, and the director of the CSIS Asia Maritime Transparency. She was also a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at CFR. Dr. Rapp-Hooper's academic writings have appeared in Political Science Quarterly, Security Studies, and Survival. Her policy writings have appeared in the National Interest, Foreign Affairs, and the Washington Quarterly. And her analysis has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and on NPR, CNN, MSNBC, and the BBC. Dr. Rapp-Hooper was the Asia Policy Coordinator for the 2016 Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. She is a David Rockefeller Fellow of the Trilateral Commission and a senior editor at War on the Rocks. She holds a BA in history from Stanford and an MA, MPhil, and PhD in political science from Columbia University. Her first book, Shields of the Republic, The History and Hereafter of America's Alliances, and there's a sample for you all to see, is forthcoming with Harvard University Press and is actually available for pre-order now for those of you who have time on your hands and no young children at home to do some extra reading. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mira. And then after her talk, we will open it up for Q&A. So please just remember that the Q&A box is there. You can type in questions at any time. If you're dialing in, you can also email Brian at bthang@network2020.org, and he will pass any questions into the queue. So thank you. Mira, over to you.
Courtney, thank you so much for a very kind introduction, and to both you and Brian for an invitation to speak with this terrific network of professionals today. And thank you all for being here. I know everybody is strapped for time these days and there are no shortage of remote events, but I've really been looking forward to this conversation and we'll be looking forward to engaging with all of you on these fundamental questions of our time. Our topic today is geopolitics after coronavirus, and I will begin with my bottom line up front. That is that as a standalone shock, coronavirus is unlikely to completely reorder the world as we know it, but that it may accelerate ongoing trends. In particular, China is sprinting to reestablish itself as a global leader, while the United States has proven unable to manage its own pandemic crisis at home, much less abroad. These dynamics will not result anytime soon in a world that is led by China, but may leave Beijing incrementally better off than it was before this crisis began. But the pandemic also seems likely to speed up other forces that are already at work. Those include the perceptions of power shifting from west to east, the relative importance of middle powers in geopolitics, and the centrality of the ability of countries to adopt new technologies as a component of their competitiveness. Taken together, these shifts suggest that the United States actually will still have a chance to recoup a post-pandemic global leadership role, but that it will need to chart its leadership on entirely new terms. Critically, that opportunity will hinge on its ability to revive and reform its alliance system for the 21st century. I'll begin with the idea that if China has its way, it will end this crisis as more of a global leader than when the crisis began. And if it is the case that China is in a better position, that will be due in part to the relative absence of the United States. This pandemic crisis is occurring, of course, in the context of trends that have been underway for some time. And here I'm thinking about the fact that power has been shifting in China's favor for several decades, although the United States still remains mighty and a geopolitical leader by any measure. In the last few years, however, China has successfully reestablished itself as a great power in Asia, and US-China relations have become far more competitive in a number of respects. Along the way, the world has been watching as each of these major powers jockey for relative positions in Asia and globally, and their bilateral relations deteriorate. That is, the world is watching both the United States and China consistently reassessing their power to understand where each stands as a matter of geopolitical leadership. But now we have a major global crisis, a shock which presents a moment that could leave a lasting shift in global perceptions. That is, can China influence the rest of the world's belief about the relative appeal of Chinese leadership as opposed to American leadership? This is a counterintuitive prospect, particularly when we consider the way that this crisis began. We would have thought that this pandemic would put China on its back foot, given that, of course, China was the initial site of the virus, that the Chinese Communist Party bungled its initial response, burying evidence of the outbreak and using harsh techniques to contain it. But as it has brought its own domestic crisis under control, it has shifted gears. China is now portraying itself as a global health leader, reportedly giving medical aid to as many as 100 countries and playing a coordinating role in international bodies. It's doing this in part to help protect the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as to allow China to sell itself as a responsible pandemic leader abroad. And it's simply too soon to tell how precisely this rush to center stage will transform China's global leadership role. Because the key question here is really whether China's crisis aid will convert to long-lasting political goodwill. So far, the picture is quite mixed, with some countries welcoming Chinese support and others acting far more skeptically. And in addition, it's worth noting that as China has delivered this aid, it's becoming clear that a lot of the aid, whether masks or coronavirus tests, are actually substandard and not performing as expected. My own rough geopolitical tabulation suggests that the international responses to China's aid largely reflects those of countries' views prior to the crisis. That is, countries that were already favorably disposed to China before the coronavirus outbreak are those that are willing to heap praise on Beijing now for sending tests, sending medical supplies, etc. And those that were more skeptical are very wary of Beijing's push to center stage and not necessarily excited to play along with this attempt by China to establish itself as a pandemic exemplar. But despite China's rise and despite this crisis attempt to rush to center stage, the United States has actually not lost much by way of relative power and remains the #1 global military and economic power, although China will catch up economically very soon. The problem on the US side of the ledger is that Washington is currently vastly underperforming its capabilities. Prior to the pandemic, global health metrics all assessed that Washington was the best prepared of any country on earth to quickly battle an outbreak like this one, but it now leads the world in confirmed cases, has a quickly mounting death toll, and has been shockingly absent from leadership roles that it held in the past in global health crises, such as during the Ebola crisis, preferring instead to deadlock bodies like the UN Security Council or the G7 group in an effort to shift the blame for the pandemic onto China. This is all to say that in this very dark hour, neither major power has acquitted itself particularly well, but that if China keeps up its mask diplomacy and recalibrates its approach while the United States remains hobbled, the United States will continue to leave space for China to fill. The world, therefore, will not emerge from this crisis convinced that China is the unalloyed next leader of the international system, and Beijing will not stand atop an entirely new global order when the crisis abates, but it may have some more influence in certain international organizations, such as the WHO, especially if the United States retreats from the WHO. It may advance some of its own initiatives that predated the crisis, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. And it may improve its bilateral political standing with some countries who become more dependent on China for medical aid or debt relief. But US-China dynamics are hardly the only ones that will shape this post-pandemic world and inform the future of geopolitics. The virus has held a lens to geopolitics that may help to accelerate other trends too. The first is a long-standing geopolitical power shift from west to east. That is away from the United States and from Europe and towards Asia centrally. The highest concentration of competent pandemic responses has been in Asia. And there we can point to countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and New Zealand as some of the best pandemic performers in these early months. In part, this unusually competent Asian response is due to history and the region's familiarity of having dealt with SARS and understanding the tools and the processes that were needed to quickly contain and manage a major outbreak in the region. But these governments also have other factors in common. These include relatively high levels of trust in government, respect for science and expertise, and relatively technocratic leadership with the capacity for swift policy implementation. Moreover, this more competent virus management and containment is likely to leave these countries with less of an economic chasm out of which they must dig when the virus abates. So while Europe and the United States seem likely to be managing their protracted economic aftershocks for quite some time to come, as the world moves from public health to economic recovery, Asia seems poised to be in a position of relative strength, accelerating this perceived power shift from west to east. Second, and related, I think we will come away from this crisis with a heightened sense of the potency of middle powers. The same set of Asian countries that I've already ticked through, plus a few others, including Germany, will have distinguished themselves as particularly resilient in this crisis, while both major powers in the US and China have appeared to stumble. This is, of course, due to a combination of factors that also includes a broad social safety net and strong public healthcare systems, as well as the factors that I've already mentioned, including high trust in government and technocratic leadership that helps these middle powers establish competent pandemic management. In the future, I think others will increasingly look to this subset of states as models for good governance. And these competent middle powers will be increasingly skeptical of both US and Chinese leadership unless either one is able to right their course and reestablish themselves as capable of good governance as well. A third accelerating trend that I would point to is the fact that I think recovery and resilience are highly likely to hinge upon countries' ability to adopt next generation technologies. In the pre-pandemic world, foreign policy analysts were increasingly worried about a phenomenon called digital authoritarianism. The idea that authoritarian governments would increasingly entrench their power and become more oppressive using digital surveillance technology. And we were increasingly worried about China in particular exporting digital surveillance technology to other autocrats. But in this crisis, we have actually seen regimes of all types using digital surveillance technologies to contain and manage this virus. And many of these countries are amongst the most competent pandemic responders that I've already named. Moreover, many of them are democracies who are nonetheless very savvy in their reliance on digital platforms. And here again, I point to a group of countries that include South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, China as well to some extent, and also Israel. The United States itself is just beginning to face down questions of what compromises it might be willing to make, as Apple and Google have pledged to roll out a contact tracing platform to manage the next pandemic phase. But whether or not the United States will be able to adopt this technology will hinge in large part on its ability to formulate policy to govern that technology, not just to innovate the technology itself. That is, to grapple with major questions like what individual privacy concessions US citizens are going to be willing to make in the name of public health and economic recovery. Several months from now, I expect that we'll see a strong correlation between countries that have widespread adoption of digital pandemic management tools and those that are managing relatively swifter economic recoveries. Which brings me to the somewhat prescriptive portion of my remarks today. I've already noted the fact that the United States has vastly underperformed its still mighty capabilities, and that if it does not right itself in and after this crisis, it will continue to lose global influence. But in part because China's own performance has been flawed, leaving the world without a capable major power, the United States can still recoup a steadier leadership role in the months to come, if it does so on modern terms. The United States is significantly past its post-Cold War power peak. It no longer has the global primacy in military or economic terms that it enjoyed for the better part of 30 years after the Cold War. And for reasons I've already indicated and that we can discuss in much more depth during the question and answer period, US-China competition is likely to continue well past this pandemic and for some decades to come in military, economic, technological, and even international order terms. But this competition will not look like the Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union, which was primarily ideological and executed under the shadow of perspective, conventional, and nuclear warfare. War between the United States and China, of course, is possible, but more likely is that the frictions between them will take the form of lower level coercion and jockeying for influence. There we can think of things like China's island building campaign in the South China Sea, increasing cyber activity between both powers, and the use of information campaigns, as well as friction over the norms and rules that govern international politics. Indeed, the coronavirus crisis is showing both powers jockeying for global influence on global health and pandemic response norms. The best US responses to this competition in the years ahead are therefore not confrontation, but efforts to reinforce existing components of the international order and to build new ones so that institutions, norms, and rules can survive the rise of another major power and continue to redound to American interests and international interests for years to come. This is, of course, a massive agenda that I'm happy to dig into more in the question and answer period, but a crucial part of it, maybe the central part of it in my mind, is an element of US statecraft that has been significantly eroded in recent years, and that is the American alliance system. The US alliance system is a vast and ambitious network of overseas defense pacts that exists in Europe and in Asia, and against all odds has actually managed to keep the peace for 70 years, when it easily might have been otherwise. But an irony of this network's success is that when alliances are working, you do not see them. That is, when alliances are working, you do not see conflict and crises remain manageable. So this remarkable experiment has actually buried its own record of success. Well before the pandemic, this alliance system was already at risk of collapse. And if the United States is to find its own footing after the pandemic, I'm arguing here today, it will need to salvage the system for the next era of leadership. The US alliance system was established in the early Cold War period to keep the balance of power in Europe and Asia through defense, deterrence, and allied assurance, and it has performed remarkably well. No US ally has ever become the victim of a major attack, and the system managed its successes at reasonable political and financial cost to the United States. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, American alliances were salvaged but lost their focus on defense and deterrence. In Europe, NATO focused on enlargement, and in Asia, American alliances largely drifted without clear purpose. But during that time period, America's former rivals were already reconstituting themselves and did not forget about the potency of this powerful system. China in particular fixated on it and put it in its crosshairs, developing both a military strategy and an approach to lower level coercion designed to split and unravel American security guarantees. 3 years ago, the United States itself joined both China and Russia as an alliance antagonist, routinely assaulting its defense pacts from within. The system is therefore on the brink of collapse just when the United States, and I would argue much of the world, needs it most. So why is it so urgent that the United States save its alliance system for the next era if it wants to continue as a global leader? After all, I've just suggested that competition between the United States and China will look nothing like the Cold War and will not be primarily focused on high-end military or nuclear conflict. The answer, I would suggest, is simple math, and that is the math of geopolitics. Despite the fact that modern competition is likely to occur in far different terms, China will overtake the United States in both local economic and military terms in Asia in the coming years. In a one-to-one matchup, the United States is poorly positioned to retain its security and political position in Asia. But when its allies in Europe and Asia are added to its ledger, Beijing is simply no match. A strong and resilient alliance system allows the United States to harness many of the ongoing trends that we've been talking about here today. That is power shifts from west to east, the rise of middle powers, and the deterministic role of new technologies, so that these are not, in fact, adverse trends at all, but rather trends that redound to the ability of the entire alliance system. Renovating America's alliances for the 21st century means bringing defense and deterrence out of just the high-end military and nuclear domains and to new areas, as into cyberspace, and to apply to attacks on democracy, as well as making those alliances more balanced and equitable, taking advantage of allies' significant intelligence, scientific, and technological capabilities. In the book that Courtney mentioned in my introduction, Shields of the Republic, The Triumph and Peril of America's Alliances, I unearthed this remarkable record of the system and give a much more detailed accounting of how and why we can salvage it for the brave new world in which we all now find ourselves. Suffice it to say for now, however, that in this global shock, coronavirus has held a lens to ongoing trends that will be with us far beyond the end of social distancing practices and a COVID vaccine. And above all else, it has laid bare the fact that in this world, the United States cannot afford to go it alone, and attempts at unilateralism and disengagement are to its own peril. I'll stop there and I'll look forward to the discussion.
All right, Mira, thank you very much. That was a really sweeping talk that you just gave, and I'm sure that there's a lot of food for thought. So just a reminder to everyone, if you want to ask questions, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and I think we see some coming in, but I'll just kick it off as they start to come in. And I'd love to hear from you, Mira. If you could just give us, if you were looking at this overall picture, what would you say some signs would be of either the US getting the alliance system right, or on the flip side of China or middle powers filling that vacuum? If you, as a scholar and you're looking at the overall picture, what are some signs that you would be looking for?
So, I think part of the reason why the United States has to reform this alliance system is because, unfortunately, I don't think middle powers are capable of filling the vacuum, just as a sheer matter of collective action and relative capabilities. I think we see in this picture extraordinary competence demonstrated in particular by a lot of traditional US allies, but that we lack the mechanisms for them to coordinate amongst themselves and to rise to the level of shared capabilities where they'll be able to exert global leadership as a unit, absent the return of a power like the United States. If I were to look for one indicator of the United States successfully moving itself towards a policy like the one that I've just laid out here, it almost certainly requires new leadership in the United States. Obviously, I've referenced this in my opening remarks, but the current president has made no secret of his antagonism towards US alliances and has actually been quite committed to antagonizing American alliances for much of his life, which has the effect of eroding the security guarantees from within. That is, convincing American allies that perhaps indeed they cannot trust Washington to provide for their own security at a time of peril. So what I'd like to see first and foremost from a new leader is not that a new president unfurls an alliance agenda and presents it to American allies, but rather that a new leader turns to American allies and asks them what the future of this system should look like if it is to be salvaged. Because it is indeed our allies who've taken so many of the hits these past years, certainly from the United States, but also from Russia and China, because they sit on the front lines of the regions where coercion is increasingly being used to exact political gains. To my mind, a great first step would be seeing a leader who convenes a conference of American allies, turns to them with a giant mea culpa, and asks what a reform agenda should look like. I obviously think that I have one here, which involves bringing defense and deterrence to new domains, but the answer really has to lie with our allies themselves.
Okay, sorry, just had to unmute myself. All right, so we're going to turn to the Q&A box. So the first question is, how should we think about great power competition in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? You mentioned that the pandemic will tend to exacerbate pre-existing fault lines, but are there issue areas in which the US may choose to poke at more, sensing Chinese weakness?
Great question. Yeah, so I'm obviously in keeping with the theme, I am very much of the view that the pandemic will accelerate aspects of great power competition that were already underway, as opposed to necessarily bring new issues to the fore. And I'll take off a few of those here. The first is that I think as perceptions sort of generally harden in both countries on China and the US respectively, you'll probably see emboldened and empowered military hardliners in both countries who get more funding because they are now even more able to make the case for the other as their central rival. So I think we'll see military competition harden. I think we will see economic competition harden because there was already a debate in the United States about decoupling from China's economy, at least with respect to higher end technologies, sensitive technologies. And now I think we'll see those debates come down to lower level manufacturing concerns, and in particular, supply chain concerns that have to do with the production of medical supplies. So I think we'll see a lot of debates over repatriation of supply chains related to pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment, which is sort of opening up the set of debates on how the United States might consider decoupling from the Chinese economy. I think we will continue to see the use of information warfare and narratives intensify. And that is largely because the United States and China have both handled the pandemic so badly thus far that each one has an incentive to blame the other. So we have seen in the United States, obviously the US president attempting to label the virus as, using divisive terminology. We have seen the Chinese messaging apparatus tried to use disinformation to place blame on the United States military as the origin of the virus, which is patently false. But the reason we should expect these types of mutual recriminations to continue, unfortunately, is that both leaders have handled their own pandemic so badly that they have incentives to deflect blame onto a rival. So I'm afraid that we will see these types of disinformation or use of divisive blame pointing accelerate in the coming months. And then finally, I would say that I think we will continue to see jockeying for influence over international order intensify. Again, in the Trump administration's prospective decision to pause funding to the WHO, you see held up concerns that it has become a tool of Chinese influence. And that to some degree may be a genuine and valid concern, but it's also clearly being hailed at this point as an effort to deflect blame from the United States' own response. So I think as these incentives for mutual recrimination continue, we'll probably see international organizations and norms themselves intensify as playing fields for great power competition. A final point that I'll make is that it is also possible that alongside this intensifying competition, we will see modestly more great power cooperation, which we obviously should be seeing already at this critical time. Prior to the coronavirus crisis, when experts talked about the areas in which the United States and China should still be able to cooperate, one was always climate change, and another one is global health. And it is in many ways alarming that US-China relations could be devolving so quickly, despite the fact that we thought this was an area where we would have mutual incentives to act. I do think it's possible that the US and China will both be racing for a vaccine and be competitive in that realm. But clearly they have incentives to cooperate on the global economic recovery, and the picture is slightly better there. And more broadly, I would just note that, of course, as long as any country is buckling under the weight of the virus, neither the United States nor China can fully recover or be fully healthy. So these deep interdependencies of the international system do ultimately give both great powers some incentive to cooperate on mitigating the worst of both the disease and the economic collapse, although we have seen such a spiral in tensions in just the last couple of months.
All right, thank you. This next question will kind of poke on that a little bit more and delve a little bit deeper. And I think it's important in light of, I think, some local level initiatives in terms of retaliatory efforts toward China. But the question is, are there any signs that the United States or other countries will take retaliatory actions, such as sanctions or policies, to China after the crisis?
So this is a set of political conversations mostly that has been ongoing, and we see those possibilities implied, in particular in debates over whether or not China and the Chinese government bears responsibility for the unleashing of the virus on the world. That is to say, can we point to areas in which the Chinese government somehow bears responsibility, and this was more than a deeply unfortunate outbreak of a virus that occurred along the normal lines we might expect? I'm thinking of the theory that has been batted around for some time. First, that the virus could have escaped from a lab in Wuhan, which of course is the site of the origin of the virus, and that it could have been a man-made Chinese bioweapon. Part of the reason behind this theory is that if you could pin blame on China as having unleashed a bioweapon on the world, this would look much more like a state level fault as opposed to a relatively natural occurrence. I think that theory has been largely disproven. I haven't seen any evidence, and I think evidence to the contrary abounds, that the virus is not man-made. But that theory has been rehabilitated in a new set of questions over whether there might have been an accidental virus escape from the same lab in Wuhan, as opposed to the virus originating at the wet market just a few miles away. And these theories are still being entertained by the U.S. government. If there was, evidence to pin them down, I think it is possible that there would be some acceptance, appreciation within, in particular, the Republican Party attempts to pin more blame on China and try to impose some kind of sanctions. I tend not to think that the evidence is going to be there, and also tend to think that if the virus somehow did escape from a lab, there actually isn't that much more state responsibility to be pinned on China than if it came from a wet market. But I do think that even the most reasonable policymaker will be looking at Chinese practices with respect to the way that wildlife is trafficked through markets to see if there are policy prescriptions for that area. That is, we've already seen the Democratic candidate for president make statements that he would call on China to reform its use of wet markets, which are a set of calls that have already been in progress for some time, and in particular push China to enforce wildlife laws that it already has on the books that prevent the keeping of multiple different types of species together in one market, which would in turn mitigate the risks of an outbreak like this happening again. So the set of policy rejoinders that I've just laid out there really run the gamut, but they depend a lot on the extent to which you think the virus itself has its origins with the Chinese government. And I just simply do not think there is a lot of evidence at this point to suggest that we're going to come up with some kind of viral smoking gun to suggest that this was actually a CCP error as opposed to a completely devastating natural occurrence facilitated by practices that could be reformed.
Okay, great. Thank you. This next question I might pass over for now, just because I think you addressed it largely already, but I'll circle back to it if we have time. And so I'm going to move on. And now we have a participant who would like you to kindly provide a model alliance for the US and Asia. What countries might be involved? We are already aligned with South Korea, Japan, Australia, but what do you see a model alliance looking like?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I think our alliances in Asia are with the absolute right countries. My suggestion of a new agenda for America's alliances is not that we need to be adding countries, and indeed, we haven't created a new mutual defense pact since the 1950s. So I think it's highly unlikely that we will create new formal security guarantees, although we have added additional members to NATO in Europe. My suggestion for alliance reform is really that the nature of defense pacts be changed to include objectives and forms of cooperation that are not just military in nature, that apply to forms of 21st century competition that fall below the military threshold, and therefore are those forms of competition that we're much more likely to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis, in particular as China continues to rise. So as I mentioned, but would be happy to dig into further, I think alliances have strong applicability to cyberspace. And in particular, the United States and its allies could work together to reform alliances to apply them to attacks on critical infrastructure that is potentially devastating attacks that could occur in cyberspace but do not rise to the level of military attacks. I also think that alliances could be deftly applied to countries' use of disinformation and interference in democratic processes. So international law already allows us to use alliances to respond to attacks on one another's political independence. And that's exactly what happened when Russia intervened in the United States 2016 elections. Without ever firing a shot or making a threat of using a nuclear weapon, Moscow hobbled the United States' political independence. And it could absolutely do so again. It's shown its will to do so in Europe. And as China moves increasingly towards the use of disinformation tools, it's possible that China could interfere in foreign democratic processes as well. So another area where I'd really like to see alliances reform to apply is to disinformation and in particular interference in democratic processes. One other note that I'll make with respect to US alliances in Asia is that quite unlike in Europe, where NATO is a multilateral pact, where all of the allies have alliances with each other, in addition to the United States. The United States has a hub and spoke system of alliances in Asia, meaning it has bilateral security guarantees with its allies, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia. But those allies don't necessarily have alliances with each other. In fact, they don't have alliances with each other. And particularly because China is continuing to rise and is increasingly a military and economic juggernaut in the region, all of those countries increasingly are and will share concerns about China's use of lower level coercion in particular. So part of what I would like to see in Asia is more mechanisms created for US allies to work with each other, in addition to strengthening the forms of deterrence that they have with the United States. We've already seen some of that occur organically with Japan and Australia significantly strengthening their defense relationship, but I think there's ample opportunity for US allies in Asia to strengthen their network amongst themselves, as well as perhaps increasingly to work with US allies in NATO on issues of mutual concern, such as in cyberspace with respect to democratic interference, and even on issues like the national security implications of new technologies like 5G. So with the same set of allies that the United States has had firmly in place with decades, I think there is a massive reform agenda that could make these tools incredibly more powerful than they are right now.
All right, okay, let's see. Thank you. Next question. What is your view on China playing the long-term game with Russia as the junior partner on removing the stranglehold of the US dollar as the global currency?
Great question. So there's sort of two questions built in there. One is about the Sino-Russian relationship, which I'll take briefly first, and one is about dollar primacy. When it comes to the Sino-Russian relationship, there's obviously ample evidence to be concerned that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have been increasingly coordinating policy in the last several years. there's no question that both China and Russia's foreign policy became much more assertive after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and really into the period ending in 2012, when both Xi Jinping came to power and Vladimir Putin came back to power. Both countries took a much sharper turn, perceiving the United States to already be in the throes of decline and believing themselves able to assert their interests in their immediate neighborhood much more ably, with the United States on its back foot following the global financial crisis. But I do think there's reason to think that the Sino-Russian relationship is not an alliance and is not going to be inexorably strong. That is, of course, because Russia has traditionally seen itself as a major power, and Putin in particular has a lot of concerns about being seen as a junior partner, as basically a matter of ego. He understands the pragmatic need to coordinate with China and deconflict with Xi Jinping to serve Russia's interests, but is also himself fundamentally interested in reestablishing Russia in its traditional sphere of influence, which includes its former backyard in Central Asia. But as China grows more powerful and pushes into Eurasia, in particular through the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia is increasingly going to have to grapple with China's increase in power on its doorstep. And that, I think, introduces the possibility of friction in the years ahead. It's also too hard to say whether the Sino-Russian alignment that we've seen in the last few years will outlast Xi Jinping and Putin themselves. So I think there's no question that there's an alignment of convenience going on right now. I do not see this as an inexorable alliance that will last for the long term necessarily. When it comes to this question of dollar primacy, which I think is a really sharp one, the question is not so much whether the Sino-Russian alliance is strong enough to route around the US dollar, but what other currency might be capable of competing with the US dollar and with the SWIFT system. For some number of years, it seemed like the euro was the best alternative to the US dollar, but of course, with European unity increasingly in jeopardy, that seems farther and farther from the horizon, which means that the renminbi would really be the only other possible currency by default that could jockey for a similarly dominant position. But while Xi Jinping has established in getting the RMB into the IMF basket of currencies and has certainly proffered any number of initiatives that seek to route around the SWIFT system, that is through things like Chinese mobile payments or efforts to circumvent US secondary sanctions on Iran, there is no evidence yet that the renminbi is really rising all that much in its ability to compete with the dollar. One of the enduring American strengths that's actually being broken open by the current coronavirus crisis is the enduring primacy of the dollar, despite the fact that the United States is scrambling on so many other fronts. When it comes to the capital injections that countries around the world are making into the global economy, we really see the strength of the dollar reinforced. So I think this question points to a strong ambition from China, which is that it should erode dollar primacy over time. It reminds us that there are any number of ways in which China and Russia both have been interested in doing so, again, by circumventing US sanctions or using things like mobile payment systems, but it also reminds us that they are a long way from achieving their goal.
All right, thank you very much. That's you broke that question down quite well. So the next question is China a trustable power? We still don't know the real source of this virus, and knowing what is happening in the rest of the world, is China's report of the coronavirus something that we should trust?
Simple answer, no, absolutely not. We have seen no reason either during this crisis or before it to believe that the numbers China reports on the number of confirmed cases, its death toll, or the economic impacts of coronavirus to hold water. But I want to emphasize that while this may be an effort by the CCP to cover up the reality of coronavirus in China, and undoubtedly some of that is the explanation here, this is also the result of bureaucratic pathologies that may be built into the Chinese system itself. And I'll say a little bit more about that in the beginning. The first point that I would make, though, is that, as implied in the question, there is every indication that the Chinese Communist Party vastly has understated the number of deaths in Wuhan and in China more broadly on account of coronavirus. We know, moreover, that the CCP spent the first several weeks of the crisis hurrying to try to cover up evidence of the virus rather than reporting widely evidence of the new coronavirus and inviting scientists in to try to help the Chinese government get their arms around it. We're learning even just today that there may have been some earlier than expected reported cases of coronavirus in the United States, with a death occurring as early as late January, which, if true, would suggest that the CCP's timeline of when coronavirus cropped up in Wuhan is actually much too late and woefully inaccurate, beyond the inaccuracies that we're already aware of. But a central point that I want to make here is the fact that these reporting inaccuracies are in some ways built into the Chinese system. That is to say that Xi Jinping himself is not necessarily censoring all of the tabulation of correct Chinese data and refusing to have it reported out, but rather that local and provincial leaders have become so used to doctoring numbers in effort to curry favor with the central party that the numbers that we would like to have with respect to China's coronavirus data as well as economic data may not even exist. Because local government leaders and provincial leaders know, for example, and have known for years that the Chinese Communist Party has certain expectations around growth targets with respect to annual economic growth, for example, they do not now or anytime in recent past report up honest assessments of regional and provincial level growth. That is, they doctor their numbers themselves to make sure that the party is seeing a picture that reflects what their overall economic targets might look like. And there's evidence to suggest that in this crisis too, we have seen local and provincial leaders doctoring their reported cases and their confirmed deaths from coronavirus to grossly minimize the impact of coronavirus when they report those up to the CCP. And I commend you all to an excellent New York Times article on exactly this subject. But the reason that this matters is that it should change our view on whether or not it's even possible to get correct numbers out of China. That is, the US intelligence community is continuing to work on the question of how inaccurate China's data is, and it should continue to press ahead with that charge because it's important for the rest of the world to have some more accurate picture of what has gone on in China. But the idea that those accurate numbers exist somewhere in a Chinese Communist Party vault and we just haven't gotten to them yet, I think is probably false. Rather, what we're looking at is a system that has created for itself incentives to provide only those numbers that are most beneficial to the Chinese Communist Party's narrative, and therefore has buried from within the grievous record of the toll that this virus has taken on the Chinese people.
All right. Thank you very much, Mira. Because we're starting to run low on time, I'm going to group some of these questions. Of my apologies to the questioners if I'm not getting the exact sentiment right. But there are about 3 questions that are dealing with US policies toward China, so I'm going to group these. And so let me see if I can find them. So one is looking at consensus within both parties with respect to U.S.-China policy. So basically, where, you know, how do you see the breakdown of policy positioning when it comes to China, and is there a difference when it comes to parties? How do you think business policies and regulations should be better changed to align with political goals with respect to China? And then lastly, how should the U.S. Address the Belt and Road Initiative?
Okay, 3 big questions. I'll try to take them as succinctly as possible for the sake of getting to others. First, you know, I think there's no question that the Trump administration has pursued a rather hard-nosed version of competition with China, but I actually think that belies the fact that there is a fair amount of domestic political consensus, at least amongst leaders on Capitol Hill and foreign policy experts from both parties, that the United States and China are in a great power competition and will be for some time. That is to say that if power changes hands in November, I expect a Democratic president would also pursue policies that assumed competition with China, although I think those policies might look different. I think in particular, there would be very little likelihood of a bilateral trade war continuing under new leadership. But I think there would be enduring concerns about China's military role in Asia and a continuing focus by the United States to shift its military prioritization to Asia. I think there would be continued, if not increased, concerns about China's role in technological development and the national security issues that that may pose, as well as concerns about Chinese investment and intellectual property theft that may jeopardize US competitiveness and commercial advantages. So I think that some of these issues will be with us for a very long time, regardless of who is in the White House, although the emphasis placed on certain components of those competitions will change. When it comes to the question of what policies are actually useful to this effect, I would actually point to a need and a hope by myself that a new leadership would really pivot to thinking about what is necessary for the United States to be a competitive great power in the 21st century, as opposed to thinking about what is primarily necessary to do to or against China. By that, I mean that the United States remains in the primary geopolitical position, so it should be primarily concerned with trying to invest in its own domestic power base to keep itself strong and resilient for many years to come, as opposed to thinking first and foremost about countering everything that China is doing. So to my mind, a smart strategy for competition with China would lead with investments in education, in innovation, things like higher levels of federal spending on research and development, on high skills immigration, and everything that the United States should be doing anyway, regardless of China's status as a great power, but that become all the more important because we do have a competitor that continues to rise in Asia. Of course, this is not to diminish the importance of the United States retaining a strong military footing in the Asia Pacific, or as I've argued, overhauling its alliances to meet this challenge. But it is to say that all of those China-facing activities are easier to accomplish if the United States itself is on a stronger domestic footing because it has invested in its own security and prosperity at home. Finally, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, this is a great question, and it's one that's changing in real time. I suspect that amongst the other changes that I've just named here today, if we reconvened a year from now, we would say that the Belt and Road Initiative looks quite a bit different than it did before coronavirus struck. In particular, we're seeing China have to pledge to put on hold the debt that many lower income countries have to China because they are now experiencing their own massive economic crises as a result of the coronavirus. And I think it will turn out that China has to renegotiate a lot of its debt with some of these countries out into the future. And as a result, we'll emphasize different aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative to keep it moving forward. I expect that we'll see China put more emphasis on the digital Silk Road, that is its technological exports, as well as a new initiative that it's just revived recently, which is its Health Silk Road, that is its efforts to improve bilateral ties with other countries through exports in the health sphere, but that it will reorient this central Xi Jinping foreign policy initiative. I think there's no question that the United States needs to put up a better response than it's had these last few years, but also that it cannot respond everywhere. That is, Belt and Road is an absolutely massive foreign policy initiative that is so poorly defined that Washington couldn't possibly counter it everywhere if it tried. So the key question is, where is this initiative most potentially threatening or problematic for the United States and its allies? And there, again, I point to the digital Silk Road and China's overarching model of lending practices as being two of the areas where I think Washington should most centrally be focused and should push ahead with its efforts to support private sector activities to bring alternatives into Asia and beyond so that it can put up something of an asymmetric competition with China there.
Okay, great, thank you. And this next question I'm going to frame a little bit as a follow-up to that, and that's the questioner is asking about how US information efforts might change in response to these less than stellar responses to COVID-19, but we can also look at it a little bit bigger picture because the questioner wants to know about what sort of counter-narrative campaigns the US can run and whether or not you see a resurrection of a Cold War era public diplomacy organ like the US Information Agency, which has been subsumed into the State Department under public diplomacy, but do you see those efforts changing?
Great question. I think this is likely to be an element of competition that is with us for a long time to come, like many others. Exactly as you suggest, the U.S. Information Agency after the Cold War was, of course, disbanded, and information and narrative engagement largely rests under the State Department as part of an office that was stood up several years ago called the Global Engagement Center. This office is still, frankly, woefully underfunded. And I also think the number of foreign policy professionals who are devoted to both studying and engaging with foreign country information warfare is vastly too small. So as part of a much broader initiative that I would like to see new leadership ideally invest in to reinvigorate and rebuild the State Department, I think there's no question that information and messaging needs to be a key priority for one of the reasons that we've already talked about, which is the fact that for both Russia and China, as well as a number of other countries, lower level coercive tools, as opposed to military tools, will continue to be more attractive for many years to come. They are less risky and they are cheaper than other forms of competition. So using information and social media in particular is massive bang for your buck if you are a regional power trying to erode the relative position of the United States. As a result, we need not only much more money being given to the Global Engagement Center to counter some of these narratives, but we need a lot more by way of foreign policy professionals who really know Russia and China and can explain how to counter those narratives to our top diplomats. I'd also point you to work being done by Laura Rosenberger, who's a friend and colleague of mine. She runs the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. And if you're not aware of that project, it's a really amazing dashboard that follows both Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns and also has some great policy prescriptions on how we can respond to them. But suffice it to say, for now, you've hit on a centrally important topic, and it's one where we've got to put a lot more resources.
All right, so in our final couple of minutes, I'm going to do a little bit of a wild card round, and you can pick among them. So we have a question that's asking how this geopolitical scenario might play out for Russia, and then another question looking, at a different region. But the questioner is asking whether America would support India and South Asia in its attempt to secure freedom of Baluchistan from Pakistan, to provide a route into Afghanistan. And also break China's access to the Gwadar warm water port in the Persian Gulf. So Russia and China's access to warm water port in the Persian Gulf.
Wow, okay, definitely a wild card.
3 minutes.
Not a Russia expert, although I did hear one of our country's great Russia experts yesterday note that he thought that the global conversation was underplaying the effects that coronavirus might have on countries that were already on their back foot. And in particular, that because Russia is so dependent on hydrocarbon prices, which of course have literally just gone through the floor, not only are Russians suffering from the public health crisis and the economic crisis, they have no clear route to recovery. So Russia, already clearly a power in decline, probably even in more abject decline than we thought because of this crisis. Great question about India. As someone who is not specifically a South Asia expert, I'm not going to jump into the weeds on that, although it sounds like the questioner should tell us more and maybe even write an article about that. But what I will say is that the United States remains sort of very high in its hopes of being able to engage India as a counterbalancer to China. And I think it's both an important set of initiatives that have been sort of ongoing in the starry eyes of American officials, at least since the George W. Bush administration. And it's a set of hopes that need to be carefully managed. Because while India is no doubt a central player in Asia as a region, and one that will become even more important as power continues to shift from west to east and the Indian economy grows, India has made it very clear that it's not interested in becoming a formal US ally and not interested in carrying Washington's water when it comes to being a direct counterbalancer to China, if that comes at the jeopardy of any Indian interests. Delhi largely sees its interests in China, mostly occurring around the Indian Ocean. So while I think it remains centrally important that the United States continue these initiatives to try to keep Delhi active in the region, and around these parts of the region that it cares about in particular. Pinning hopes too high on Delhi becoming the next formal American treaty ally who can counterbalance Beijing is a set of aspirations that unfortunately is likely to fail pretty miserably. But thank you for those great grab bag questions.
All right, thank you so much, Mira. And you made it just to time. I think you handled those very well. Just a couple of notes. Just thank you, Mira, so much for this just really wonderful talk and Q&A session. Thank you to everyone who participated, and particularly to those who asked great questions. Mira, if you wouldn't mind, if you could send us the New York Times article I think you mentioned, and also the German Marshall Fund, what we can do is I believe we can send them out to all the participants after. So you'll have those links. Brian will also be sending out a survey too, if you wouldn't mind filling that out. It just helps us as we start to do these virtual briefings more, figure out what works and what doesn't, and change it up. And lastly, our next briefing is Monday at 1 p.m. with Ms. Ahuna Okonwa, who is the head of UNDP's Africa Bureau, and she will be talking about responding to the crisis in Africa. So it should be really interesting. Again, these virtual briefings are free and open to all, so please do encourage friends, family, colleagues to join, because the more people we have worldwide, the more interesting of a conversation we'll be able to have too. So Mira, a big round of applause to you. Thank you, and everyone have a great day and stay safe.
Thanks, Courtney. Thank you all.